Right now, Formula 1 is the Max Verstappen show.
For the first time in F1 history, it's 10 wins in succession. He did it in 21, he did it in 22, he's going to do it in 23. It's another perfect afternoon for the defending world champion, and it's a hat-trick of wins in front of his home fans.
Over the past 3 years, Red Bull have won 2 Constructors' titles, and Max has now won 3 consecutive Drivers' titles, joining a very exclusive list of drivers including Fangio, Schumacher, Vettel, and Hamilton to do so. Since 2021, in 61 races, he has stood on the podium 51 times, taken 27 pole positions, and won 39 Grand Prix. Like in all sports, however, during periods of dominance, the question is always not how long the winning will last, but who will be the one to topple the current king of Formula 1. Predicting when a period of dominance is going to stop is tricky because you've got to ask yourself first and foremost, what's going to stop Red Bull from having yet another dominant car? Given that the regulations are going to be stable in 24 and 25 before the new rule cycle comes in 2026, there's certainly nothing to suggest that Red Bull, at the very least, will stop being race winners for the next 2 seasons. The thing that might be tricky for Red Bull in 2026 will be their transition from the pseudo factory team with some Honda expertise that they are now to the full-blown Ford manufacturer team that they will become, building their own power unit entirely from scratch. That's a much bigger challenge than it sounds because whilst Red Bull have invested a huge amount in hiring the right people and also building dedicated brand new infrastructure to house Red Bull powertrains, there's no certainty that they'll continue to have the class-leading power unit from the get-go. For 2026, the power units themselves are undergoing massive changes, which will present a different technical challenge or potential stumbling block for a brand new power unit division. There will be a brand new fuel that will be 100% carbon-free of any fossil fuels. The electrical power will now be tripled by means of a more powerful MGU-K. The MGU-H, which is considered the most complex and expensive part of the power unit, will be removed, and there will be a reduction in fuel allowance, meaning that the race start fuel will go down from 100 kilograms to just 70. Having said that, the one thing that definitely is on Red Bull's side is that the purpose of these changes is to make the power units more simpler, and that inherently means that there's going to be less area for an advantage to be gained or lost. To be honest, even with where we are now with the power units, whether you have a Red Bull power unit or a Renault power unit, it doesn't feel like there's a massive performance differentiator. You can win races with any power unit on the grid, and I think the biggest area of development where the teams are trying to find performance is now with reliability. I mean, one of the least talked about strengths of the all-conquering RB19 has been its reliability. Another thing that's very interesting to talk about is the lack of any intra-team competition at Red Bull. Now, this is a bit of a difficult subject to talk about, and it can be a bit of a double-edged sword because having either 2 drivers who are very close to each other or a clear number 1 and number 2 dynamic can both have its positives and also its negatives, and I think that it's very circumstantial. For example, if I use Fernando Alonso's previous 2 teammates, in 2021, Alpine finished ahead of AlphaTauri in the Constructors, despite having a slower car overall because they had 2 very close and competitive teammates. Whilst in 2023, once Aston Martin is overtaken by McLaren, they'll have actually under-delivered relative to the season because they only have 1 driver, Fernando Alonso, scoring points. Red Bull is an environment that is absolutely suited to a clear number 1 and number 2. Under Horner and Marco, I have never seen the ability to be able to manage 2 equal drivers, and even when they did have their closest lineup on paper in Verstappen and Ricciardo, Daniel left in part because he started to feel the team and management gravitate towards Max. Although Perez has had a disappointing season, it's clear that the team is looking for a similar caliber of driver to partner alongside Max. Unlike Ferrari, who we know actually tried to pair up Hamilton and Leclerc, I don't think I could ever see Red Bull even trying to do something like that at the risk of unsettling the dynamic with Verstappen. It feels too easy to say if it ain't broke don't fix it, but Putting an Alonso, Hamilton, or Leclerc in the mix would just be a powder keg ready to explode, and I think even though there has been a lot of rumours about Lando Norris potentially being on the table for 2025, that would also be a tricky lineup to manage if Lando lives up to his potential in a race-winning car. In short, I think the type of second driver that fits into the Red Bull environment is someone who complements Max rather than challenges him. That's the type of partnership that I think suits the Red Bull team best, and so that's why even if Red Bull do make title-winning cars for the next 3 or 4 years, you can guarantee that it would be only Max winning those titles, because I don't think the team wants, or more importantly, needs to try and put a driver in who could potentially beat Max in the same team. Although Red Bull control a lot of what will determine their future success with Max, the performance of the other teams is something that is completely out of their hands. During a period of dominance, it's never the job of the driver and team dominating to slow down. It's the job of the others always to catch up. It was the same when Lewis was dominating and Ferrari and Red Bull were playing catch up, and it's the same now with Max dominating, with expectations of Mercedes and Ferrari to catch up. This season has been a frustrating one to watch because of how boring and predictable it's been, but I am just never one of those people that puts any portion of the blame on Max, because what he's done this season has been truly historic, and at times I have been in awe of his consistency more than anything else. Whilst I think his teammate definitely takes a portion of the blame given that he's driving the same car, the reason why 2023 has been as boring as it has is down entirely to Mercedes and Ferrari. They both came into the season with evolutions of their concepts from last year, and pretty early in the season they admitted that from 2024, they'll have to start from scratch with brand new concepts. Mercedes and Ferrari are already factory teams with their own power unit, and there is absolutely nothing stopping them from a personnel or infrastructure standpoint from making at least race-winning cars. Although the season is not yet over, to win one race as a collective is embarrassing, especially when you have the likes of Hamilton and Leclerc in your cars, both of which are more than good enough to take the fight to Verstappen. Aston Martin and McLaren are a bit of a different story. Aston Martin themselves admitted that this season the other teams being as bad as they have been has artificially made them look better than they are, whilst with McLaren, whilst they've been the feel-good story of the season because of their resurgence, they also have no more excuses in 2024. Although McLaren are a customer team of Mercedes, as I mentioned earlier, because of how close the power units are these days, I don't think that you can use that as an excuse for not being able to win races. You'll hear a lot about teams building up to become race winners and championship contenders, and whilst I don't expect Aston Martin, for example, who are still building up to that level to challenge Red Bull in 2024, McLaren to me are now in that bracket with Mercedes and Ferrari, who all have the resources and no more excuses as to why they can't win races next season. That brings me on to my next point, and actually the thing that excites me most for the future, and that's the drivers. I've said this for a while now, but I honestly think at the front of the grid, we have such a high caliber of driver. The drivers who to me right now, I have absolutely no doubt in the right car could challenge and maybe even beat Max, are Lewis and Fernando. Fernando is definitely the wild card between the two of them because whilst we saw Lewis fight Max as recently as 2021, Fernando hasn't been in a title fight since 2012. And yet, the level that he's been driving at, especially when he had a really good car at the beginning of the season, with that early run scoring 6 podiums in 8 races, I just can't discount him as a championship-capable driver still. Although perhaps it's a little too early to talk about Piastri as a title contender for 2024, even if he is given a race-winning car, I am not also going to discount it entirely because this guy is clearly very special, and at the rate that he's been improving at, who's to say that he can't win a couple of races up against Verstappen if given the right car next season. Having said that, when it comes to the more established drivers like Leclerc, Norris, Russell and Sainz, whilst perhaps they don't have the pedigree right now, they have all shown moments of quality throughout 2022 and 2023 that at least make me think that they could push Max under the right circumstances. This is something that I want to dive deeper into in a different video, but what I'm trying to say is that I don't feel like if you give those drivers a competitive car, that they'll be embarrassed up against Max. On the contrary, just looking at what Leclerc did last season, for the 10 or so races during which he did have a race-winning car, and the time that we thought that we actually had a bit of a title fight, although Ferrari and some of his own mistakes did hold him back, in terms of outright speed, there were plenty of races where Leclerc went toe-to-toe with Max and was even the quicker driver. The point is, whilst I do think Max is the absolute best driver in F1 right now, I don't think there's a massive margin that's impossible to close between him and the drivers behind, especially the ones who haven't even been given the chance to prove themselves in race-winning cars. No one at the end of 2020, which was dominated by Hamilton and Mercedes, could have predicted that the very next season would be arguably the greatest in Formula 1 history. And now, granted, that was almost entirely down to a rule change that was blatantly introduced to target and slow down Mercedes, but even so, the law of diminishing returns is a real thing in Formula 1. There's going to come a point where Red Bull are going to start hitting the ceiling, and the gains that the other teams will be making will be significant enough to make them contenders. And no one knows when Max or Red Bull will be matched, let alone beaten to a championship. We are seeing one of the all-time great drivers in one of the all-time great teams operating at their absolute best, and just like when Max, yes, controversially toppled Lewis in 2021, the build-up intention over the years to find out who's going to be the next one to stop him will make that moment even better when it happens. Well, as long as it doesn't happen like Abu Dhabi 2021, I mean. Despite how predictable Formula 1 is, the reason why we as fans will always come back season after season is not just because we're passionate about the sport, it's also because, despite that predictability in the moment, the hope for a better season will always be there because the future, by its very definition, is anything but predictable. Well, there you have it. If you did enjoy this video and want to support the channel, then don't forget to subscribe. That would be massively appreciated, and I'll see you in the next one.